Our next speaker, Sarah Shear, is an assistant professor of social studies education at Penn State Altoona. Her research focuses on K-12 social studies curriculum within Indigenous contexts. Ms. Shear examines issue of race and settler colonialism in social studies state standards and textbooks, teacher education, film, and qualitative research methodologies. Ms. Shear's presentation, Manifesting Destiny, Representation of Native People and Nations in U.S. History and Civics State-level Standards, will take a critical look at how K-12 social studies state-mandated content standards include or erase Indigenous people and Native nations from the telling of U.S. history and civics, as well as highlight how some states and organizations are working to address these curriculum problems. Let's welcome Ms. Shear to this podium.
Good afternoon. I just want to begin by thanking the staff and community at the Museum of the American Indian for welcoming me here today to speak and share with you the things that I've been learning in my research and in my advocacy and in my teaching with pre-service teachers at Penn State and in other parts of the country. I'd like to begin too with an acknowledgement of where we are, that all education, all social studies education in particular, because it's where social studies is that I center my work, takes place on Indigenous lands. And social studies has struggled since its inception over 100 years ago to recognize and acknowledge this truth and to create curriculum that affirms Indigenous ways of knowing and sovereignty. Some of the issues I'd like to highlight about state-level content standards that often go hand in hand with the textbooks that accompany them in classrooms across the country are several pieces from theoretical writings in critical race theory and settler colonial theory. One is the idea of continents of mind and geographies of violence. So in social studies, when we speak of continental armies during the American Revolution or the Continental Congress at the creation of the American government and nation, we are already thinking in terms of the taking of land as a continent, not a singular or small area of land. We are expanding already what it is that we as a nation seek to claim. The other that we see in social studies is a move to innocence, the seeking of settler teachers and communities in finding ways to remove themselves from responsibility of knowing about erasure, about the denial of broken treaties, and forgive themselves from taking responsibility to act in allyship with Indigenous nations to correct that learning in our classrooms. The other is grammars of race and the racialization and the racism directed at Indigenous peoples and their sovereign nations in our curriculum and in our classroom teachings, oftentimes perpetuated horribly in the month of November during lessons about Thanksgiving. Yes, we'll talk about Thanksgiving in a minute. Another one is the idea that when the Europeans came, they came to an empty continent. The U.S. had no intention of honoring the treaties it signed, and that it would continue to push west in its manifest destiny and create the continental country that it so richly needed and desired. The other is a blindness in our curriculum that it is fully Western. We think about time from a Western conception. We think about ways of knowing and defining who we are through Western lenses, and it erases the ways of knowing of the Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous students in our classrooms. And the last one, this one I think is the biggest one that social studies continues to perpetuate, is a denial that the United States is a colonial power. Regularly, we will see units of study in textbooks and in standards and in classrooms across the country, and even in our conferences that we will soon be going to for social studies, talking about colonialism and imperialism elsewhere. And we often keep ourselves out of the list of countries who have sought to control other people and other lands. And so I have this long quote here from Dr. Dolores Calderon about teaching primarily white teachers. This is the context in which I also work. And as a non-Indigenous teacher, educator, and researcher working within Indigenous contexts in several ways, we must begin to read the scholarship and the teaching of Indigenous teachers and Indigenous scholars. And I do this with my students not to, and as Dr. Calderon talks about, not to deny who they are, right? But to challenge who we are, to recognize ourselves as settlers and to recognize the history that comes with that. And so reading the works of Dr. Leilani Sabzalian, Sandy Grande, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, Dina Hillier-Whitaker, and Debbie Reese, Indigenous scholars and educators working across the country and around the world as non-Indigenous educators, these are the mirrors that we should be learning from and not only reading from ourselves. And so to follow up on the textbook presentation, this is an image from a 2019, I'm going to say that one more time, 2019 Pearson 5th grade textbook. And I pulled out two quotes from the page. Then in 1828, gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia. Suddenly, this American Indian land was very valuable. How could settlers take possession of it? 2019, 5th grade, Pearson textbook. And under this law further down, the United States government gave American Indians unsettled prairie land. Again, so coming back to an earlier slide, the moves to innocence, well, we were here, right? The settlers found gold. We have the underlying tones of capitalism as a foundational piece of the American story. Empty land because no one was living in this narrative out in the West, in the prairie, and in denial that this is colonialism and that we are teaching and talking to 5th graders about a colonial mentality towards the creation of the United States and the removal of Indigenous peoples from their own lands. Again, this is the same 2019 Pearson 5th grade textbook talking about Alaska and Hawaii, and I quote, "Most Americans didn't think Alaska was much of a bargain. Then gold was discovered along the Klondike River near Alaska in 1896. Americans suddenly began to see its value, as if it didn't have value to the people who had lived there since time immemorial." That is not included in this textbook, nor is it included in the narrative further down of the annexation or theft of Hawaii and the removal of its sovereign. So again, building off of the textbook research that's already been done, we continuously see, even in the books that are soon to be coming out in 2019, these problematic narratives of manifest destiny and Indigenous erasure. Even within the National Council for the Social Studies, we struggle still to come to terms with the way narratives are shared in our field. This is from the NCSS Smart Brief, which is a daily, sometimes weekly blast email with articles from around the country. And this one from 2016, November, about students participating in the traditional Thanksgiving feast. No recognition of the problematics, not only of that image, but of the lesson itself. So textbooks the field of social studies, and now the standards. Again, I would just like to quote Dr. Crow, that settler colonialism matters because the narratives that we see perpetuated in our textbooks and in our state standards allow the predominant settler population to not recognize itself as being settler. We have narratives in our world history textbooks and other aspects of our US history curriculum where we point out of colonialism and imperialism in other parts of the world, but yet pat ourselves on the back as not being that, when that's exactly who we have been and continue to be. And so this data that I'm going to show you was from a study that I did with my colleagues, Ryan Knowles, Greg Soden, and Tony Castro, between 2011 and 2013, and we published it in 2015. This is a national study of K-12 US history standards and their representations of Indigenous peoples within the American story. We began to notice, and we were thinking about the changes of time, and we had consulted Dippy's work on what he called the quote-unquote Indian problem and the closing of the West in and around the turn of the 20th century. And so we began to look at the standards and how it included or did not include Indigenous peoples and nations in that time split. And what we see here is a predominance of inclusion before the year 1900 and very scant inclusion of Indigenous peoples and nations in the standards after the year 1900. And this is both for elementary and for middle and secondary. Put another way, this is all the states and Washington, D.C. You will see, again, in the dark bars, those are the inclusions of a pre-1900 inclusion of Indigenous peoples. So when I think about the 40% of Americans who just recently in the survey did not know that Indigenous peoples were still alive, I can see how that is reflected in the state standards themselves, because the state standards are largely confining Indigenous peoples to inclusion, and a very carefully scripted inclusion, before the year 1900. Shown another way, this is the percentage of inclusions post-1900, and you'll see that Maine has a very high percentage at 50%, but in all of its K-12 standards, there were less than 20 specific inclusions of Indigenous peoples at all. So even within Maine's inclusion of Indigenous peoples post-1900, it's very rare across the grades. And then you'll also see a number of states who have no inclusion past the year 1900, and it makes me think about Massachusetts and the current rejection of sovereignty of the Mashpee Wampanoag, and whether or not students know that that nation exists, because it does not exist in the Massachusetts standards. Massachusetts does not include anything past the year 1900. And so when we look at this and take it down to a number that we can begin to think about, it's 87%. When we look at the United States up until the standard, we stopped researching in 2013, 87% of state standards that do include specifically Native nations or Indigenous peoples or content related to Indigenous peoples, 87% of what does exist is in a pre-1900 context. Pairing that with the 40% of Americans who do not know or did not know at the time they took the survey that Native peoples are still alive, we can begin to point our finger at social studies as being central to the problem of not understanding indigeneity in the United States. And this too, the number of states that included specifically named Indigenous peoples, 27 had none. Those that did included Sacagawea, Pocahontas, Squanto, but always they were included as a sidekick to a white American story like Lewis and Clark. Never were the inclusions alone about their contributions to their tribal nations or to their citizenship. It was always to the contribution in the creation of the United States. And so what some of these look like, the narrative, the manifesting destiny as the story of the United States, Indigenous peoples are often presented as either an outsider or an insider to that story, depending on where in the narrative they would fit to make manifest destiny make sense. So in Massachusetts, identifying the Wampanoags in the time of the Pilgrims. So always, again, coming back to this Thanksgiving story. Or in North Carolina, analyzing historical developments of Native American life in the period prior to the Civil War. Again, we're always looking at, even in North Carolina, this high school curriculum, these standards were for a course on Native American history, but that was in a Western American time frame, always tied to a settler event, such as the Civil War or the closing of the railroad. We also see a dramatic shift from elementary to high school of Indigenous peoples being friends and then foes. Friendly in the beginning, when settlers are first arriving, and then moving into war narratives and conflict as the United States pushed west. And then ultimately a means to an end where we see even the ideas of legislation and land policies as how did the United States close what Dippy called the Indian problem, using legal means and maneuvers to deny sovereignty and treaty rights. States have since begun to revise their standards, and I hope to revisit this national study in the coming years and look to see what, if anything, has changed. I took a quick look at some of the states, New York being one of them, who revised their standards in 2016, 2017. But again, Indigenous peoples are still part and parcel to a manifest destiny story, so much so that the standards themselves are actually called the manifest destiny unit. The idea of inclusion for inclusion's sake is also part of the problem in our state standards. We have to analyze why we're including and how we're including and who actually gets to determine the story that's included and the voices who are heard. I'm looking now with my colleagues Leilani Subzalian and Jimmy Snyder at the civics and government standards to see how do those present narratives. Are they similar to the US history standards? Are they different? How do they include or erase? And this is a study that's ongoing. We are still going through all of the data, but I will share just a few highlights. We do this study because of something that Francis Raines challenges us in social studies to think about, which is how do we talk about core values such as freedom, liberty, and justice in a country that has a continuing legacy of oppression and intimidation within its own borders? So how can we talk about the Constitution if we don't talk about the language that the Constitution has about Indigenous peoples? How can we talk about treaties with foreign countries, but we don't talk about treaties with Native nations? This is what we're looking at in studying the national standards for civics. And so I just want to include some of these examples of what we call inclusion or erasure, right? So specific inclusions, which are on the left, such as South Dakota's, looking and including tribal governments as something that students will learn about in their high school curriculum. But on the right, Louisiana, which has within its borders 4 federally recognized nations, does not include tribal governments in its list of governments for students to learn about. So these are the questions that Leilani, Jimmy, and I are asking of the standards of how are tribal governments included or not? How is Indigenous sovereignty and citizenship included or not? And how does this help us understand the problems that we see continuing to arise, not only in the refusal of sovereignty to the Mashpee Wampanoag, but also the voter suppression and the resistance to that suppression ongoing in North Dakota ahead of the midterm elections. And we do this work, and this is from a book that's in press that Leilani has written, and it's why we do this work. Because students will go out into the world, and they will become voters, they will become leaders, they will be the next generation of policymakers, and if they don't learn about tribal governance, if they don't learn about tribal sovereignty and citizenship, we will continue to see the perpetuation of erasure and these settler logics of 40% of Americans not believing Indigenous peoples are here. So this work is incredibly important, and we have to, as educators, scrutinize the work that we do and why we do it. But there are moments of change. There are people coming together. And I think about these movements as a non-Indigenous educator, and what Dr. Bettina Love calls on us to do is to be co-conspirators, kind of rethinking the word ally, to being co-conspirators for necessary change, for needed change in our curriculum. And I point directly to social studies as the field of education that I have dedicated my life to, that we have to hold ourselves accountable for our textbooks, for our curriculum, for the way that we teach, and for the way that we prepare our future teachers to embody culturally responsive pedagogies, to embody justice. And so learning from the movements in Washington, the since time immemorial curriculum and new requirements that teacher educators prepare future generations of teachers to include Indigenous curriculum into their content. Also, Montana's work for Indian education for all, and the years of work they have done to bring these lesson plans to the web. And so I often use these with my students in Pennsylvania. And they often ask me, why are we looking at Montana's curriculum if I live in Pennsylvania? And I said, well, maybe you'll move to Montana one day. Or maybe we can rethink your Thanksgiving lesson using what Montana is talking about, right? Expanding our horizons as educators in our states. Also, Oregon's new work in SB 13. I'm honored to be working with the state of New Mexico on new curriculum in their state, Wyoming, South Dakota, also language revitalization in Alaska, standards in Hawaii. So states that are moving and recognizing that there are these historical issues in the curriculum and saying, how do we put a stopgap on this and change our practice? I'd like to for there. So with rethinking the National Council for the Social Studies, the 10 thematic standards, to indigenize them, to help our teachers and our pre-service teachers and our students different time that is understood, whose stories get to be told. And the work of the Zen Project, the work of Debbie Reese, and education organizations across the country. So there's these movements across platforms, across areas of expertise, and I think it's really providing us a sense of hope, because when we look at the standards themselves, it can often be really daunting to think about that 87% statistic and how we're going to counter it. But I think we can begin to see the movements across the states and in organizations and the coming together of people to say enough is enough, and especially for social studies, that social studies needs to change. And in that, some of us got together and moved the National Council for the Social Studies to acknowledge that this is a problem and that we have to do something about it. And so just this past April, we wrote, and it was approved and it was published from NCSS, a position statement about the need for social studies to take responsibility for how it teaches to and about Indigenous peoples and nations, and providing resources and guidance to social studies educators and teacher educators on how to create meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities, how to rethink the narratives that we present. And so this is all work and momentum that we just have to keep pushing, and not fall back into comfort and say, oh, well, we have a position statement, so we're okay now. No, this is just a step that we all have to keep pushing forward for more change. And so I end with my students who, in central Pennsylvania, we are a mere hour and a half from Carlisle. None of them knew what was there. Most of them have grown up in that area their entire life and did not know about the boarding schools. They themselves come to class and ask, how many Native Americans are still alive? Did Indigenous peoples ever live in Pennsylvania? And so we draw on the work of Indigenous scholars and educators, Debbie Reese's work, helping us rethink the choice of children's literature to center Indigenous storytellers in Indigenous stories, rethink why are we choosing storybooks, whose story are we learning from, but then also how do we think our curriculum and looking at the before and after pictures. What is it about the narrative of the boarding schools, particularly as a difficult history in Pennsylvania, that they think they never learned about? Why is that a problem? And how are they, as future teachers, going to be part of the change that we are talking about today in transforming education? And so I thank you. I hope to speak to you on Twitter or on email and in person today.
Thank you, Dr. Shears.